centuries tried to live the call to Christian discipleship. The Middle Ages, so the early Middle Ages were ushered in with the fall of the Roman Empire. And I want to talk a little bit about how the Roman Empire came to disintegrate, as it were. The Romans had ruled provinces in Europe, the Middle East, and Northern Africa for nearly 1,000 years. So you might remember the name of St. Augustine. St. Augustine, he came from Northern Africa, as did many of the early church fathers. They were all Roman provinces. So you had the center at Rome, and then it kind of radiated out and took in these provinces in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Challenges to Roman security increased during the 1st century as tribes from what the Romans called Germania, Germany, began to confront the Romans. Now, although we're saying that the Middle Ages don't begin until 453, when the last Roman emperor was deposed, in 410, the city of Rome was sacked. After 4 centuries of contact with the Roman Empire, Germanic tribes had undergone massive technological, social, and economic changes. From the 1st to the 4th centuries, their populations, economic production, and tribal confederations grew. Moreover, their ability to conduct warfare increased to the point of challenging Rome. This culminated with the sack of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth in 410, which was a catastrophic event. I cannot emphasize enough what a traumatic and catastrophic event this was. I mean, Rome was the center of the civilized universe. I mean, it would be akin to the attacks of 9/11. You know, nobody ever thought that these barbarians, you know, they were having problems with them at the peripheries, but that they were actually able to invade and get to the center of the Roman Empire and sack the city of Rome. And it wasn't the first time Rome would be sacked. There were multiple times from this point on where Rome was so weakened that these barbaric tribes would come in waves and sack Rome. So it was not the Rome we know today, but it was just, and the impact of this on people's consciousness, I mean, it was traumatic, absolutely traumatic. In fact, this happened before the death of St. Augustine, and he himself talks about this. Now, he's not even in Rome, he's in Northern Africa, but it was such a signal event that it really kind of shook the consciousness of many people. And of course, there's the picture, they're sacking, you know, the temples, you know, a bishop, whether he's the Pope or not, you know, they just kind of came in waves, and they would try, sometimes, at this point, the emperor was trying to negotiate with the Visigoths not to come and sack. The Pope was pleading, but to no avail. Now, more definitively, one of the consequences of this weakening of Rome was the division of the empire into 2 parts. So there was a Western Roman Empire, capital city of Rome, and then there was the Eastern Roman Empire, the capital city of Constantinople, which was also the Byzantine Empire. And that's, you know, as we talk about the Western and the Eastern Church, the Western Church is the Roman Church. The Eastern Church is the Byzantine, or the capital at Constantinople. By the end of the 400s, Rome had been weakened by political instability, so there was instability internally. Roman legions were stretched thin across the empire that was too large to defend easily. And these German tribes, such as the Goths, you know, are you know, ancestors, probably. The German tribes, such as the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Angles, and the Saxons, took advantage of this weakness. And in 476, the Visigothic king Odovacar removed the last Western Roman emperor from power. Kind of represented here with this, Goth or barbarian, kind of like taking his club and taking off the head of that Roman statue. You know how much the Romans loved their statues, celebrating the emperors and their great conquerors. So what was the aftermath of these barbaric invasions? So that was basically these invasions were coming from the north, they were converging on Italy, on the center of the Roman Empire. What were the barbarians after? Well, they were after the roads, the farmlands, the wealth of the Western Roman Empire. And to be fair, I mean, when you think about it, the Roman Empire was not, they had these provinces and they were conquerors. But as we know from the scriptures, even from the New Testament, they were not exactly kindly toward the peoples they had conquered. So there was a lot of hostility and animosity, that kind of built up. But an unintended consequence of conquest was the conversion of the barbarian conquerors to the Christian religion. And this ensured that throughout Europe, Christianity would define European culture throughout the Middle Ages. So as the barbarians came, the church kind of worked with them. And they eventually, they were able to convert them. And we're going to see a little bit more about that. But the end of the Western Roman Empire meant that the political unity of Europe had collapsed. Rome was basically, they were the major power, and they basically kept the lid on everybody. They were a stability. They maintained stability and kind of kept things in check. The German tribes, though, once they entered the empire and the empire collapsed, they formed their own kingdoms, rendering centralized government and cultural unity impossible. Many improvements in the quality of life introduced during the Roman Empire decayed substantially, including relatively efficient agriculture, extensive road networks, water supply systems, shipping routes, and artistic and scholarly endeavors. If you've ever had a chance to visit Spain and some other parts of Europe, there's this marvelous system of aqueducts which brings water to some of these towns and cities that were challenged in terms of the amount of water that they were ready to access. So Rome had a very sophisticated, technological, savvy culture, which they were able to administer from the center. Well, now all that's kind of unraveled. In the midst of all of this, of the devastation that was left in the wake of the barbaric invasions, the main source of continuity from Roman to medieval times was the church. Remember that Christianity toward the end of the Roman Empire had been legalized and then actually became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So the church is kind of a bridge, if you will, between the Roman Empire, late classical antiquity, and the Middle Ages. So they're an institution that provides stability and continuity in some way. The church had arranged diplomatic meetings with the leaders of the barbarian tribes prior to the fall of Rome. The church successfully sent waves of missionaries into German tribal areas and other parts of Europe. For example, St. Patrick to Ireland, and of course St. Augustine of Canterbury was sent to England. So the church saw this, it was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity. It was an opportunity to evangelize and to convert these people to Christianity. Now that would be a very long, complicated process because there were some tribes they could get to, others they couldn't. And of course, as we know, some of the missionaries, not the two up here, Patrick and Augustine, were martyred. There certainly were martyrs. Another stabilizing institution was monasticism. Monasticism really began in the East, and the first Christian monk was probably Saint Anthony of Egypt. And monasticism in the East, the primary form that it took was solitary. It was not, at the beginning, communal. So it would be a solitary hermit living in a cave, living somewhere on the outskirts, never in the city, of course. It was always in some point of isolation, usually like the desert, something like that. But the person would have a reputation for holiness, and then people would go out there to the desert. So the irony of it is that the monk would go out to the desert to get away from society, and then society would be drawn to the monk like a magnet. And we'd go there, for spiritual guidance, for direction. Once the monks, some of them, if they were priests, and most of them initially were not, they would, and that's why I would say they would go more for spiritual guidance. They might go for confession, for the sacrament of reconciliation. However, in the West, from the get-go, the form that monastic life takes is communal. And the founder of Western monasticism is a gentleman by the name of Saint Benedict. And the group, of course, that he founded are the Benedictines. So the Benedictine monasteries, and at this point in the West, it was just the Benedictines. They not only had the monopoly, but they were the only show in town, so to speak. Benedictine monasteries, which dominated religious life in the early Middle Ages, were living symbols of stability and immutability, so of, unchangeableness, in the midst of a world constantly in flux. Towns often grew up around these monasteries. So again, the Benedictine monks, they were not urban. And of course, one of the characteristics, of the early Middle Ages is basically urban society is broken down. The effect of the barbaric invasions was basically many of the cities were destroyed or were severely impacted. And so there was a return to kind of more of a rural society. And as Anthony of Egypt, so the Benedictines, these monasteries were on the outskirts. However, again, it would draw people, and they would begin to form towns around there. People would be drawn to the liturgy. The monks, of course, would celebrate liturgy at the monasteries, and lay people, people would come. And also they were attracted, they were kind of like amazed by the elaborately organized life of the monasteries, which were kind of oases in the desert. So they were kind of replicas of heaven on earth. It was also in the monasteries where Western culture was preserved through a vital manuscript culture. In the monasteries, monks would be trained in the copying of manuscripts. Today, if we want to copy something, we take it to the copier and do it. We're not writing these things out longhand. The monks would be trained, first of all, this was a culture and society in which the vast majority of people, I mean, maybe as high as 95%, were illiterate. And so these monks would be taught to read and write, and they would be taught to do these intricate scrolls, manuscripts that we see. And that is how culture, religious culture, civic culture was preserved. And I think there are a number of popular books that talk about this, of how they say how the church preserved culture and civilization. It was the monks who were they were the ones in the trenches doing this. So the monks became these centers of learning and evangelization for a Europe devastated by the barbarian invasions. And then a little bit later on, in the early Middle Ages, missionaries were sent from Ireland and England. Now remember, in the early period of the early Middle Ages, the church sent missionaries to Ireland and England. They established monasticism and Christianity there. However, maybe 2-3 centuries later, missionaries are going from Ireland and England back to continental Europe to convert Germanic tribes and other areas which had remained beyond the scope of the initial period of evangelization. So evangelization and missionary work was a very dynamic part of the early Middle Ages. It was something that was constantly unfolding. There is kind of a bright spot in the early Middle Ages, if there is one. So we have the church and monasticism in the aftermath of the barbaric invasions and the devastation that they lead. There's these two institutions, we might say, of constancy or stability, the church and monasticism. There is this period from the 8th to the 9th century, which was presided over by Charlemagne, who was he basically was able to unify the Franks, all the tribes that, I mean, I guess we would say today, present day France. There might be some German mixed in there. But he was able to unite these tribes into a kingdom. This, of course, is what would happen later in the early modern period, the rise of the national state going into the early modern period, where you have the formation of countries, Spain, France, Germany, etc. The long reign of Charlemagne created a Frankish empire marked by strong allegiance to the Christian faith and a return to and renewal of the Roman Empire. So there was always that dream of returning to the Roman Empire, to that time of peace. I mean, if you're living in the devastation of the aftermath of the barbaric invasions, you're kind of thinking, oh, if only for the good old days, peace and tranquility, even if they were a bit harsh, but but as you know, memory fades. So anyway, Charlemagne was actually crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III in 1800, Christmas Day in 800. Monasteries played a key role in Charlemagne's vision for religious and spiritual unity within his realm. So during this period, he wanted every monastery was to have a school. And many peoples who studied in these schools subsequently brought the fruit of their learning and study to other monasteries throughout Europe, where they in turn founded schools. So it just didn't look inward, but it really kind of had a larger impact that would benefit much of Europe. with a lot of these pupils going from these schools, from the monastery schools. Now again, how many people went to these schools? I mean, we're not talking schools the size of Salesiana. I mean, we're probably talking about a relatively small number of students. Again, given what the rates of literacy were. But these were very dynamic individuals who were in positions of leadership and had the ability and the opportunity to impact culture and society. However, unfortunately, the Carolingian unity and order was not to last. His empire fell into disintegration and chaos again due to internal strife, conflict, and division, and a renewed wave of invasions, this time by the Danes and Vikings from the north. You know, the Vikings made it as far as Paris. So there was always that threat. And then later on, of course, there was always the threat of invaders coming from the east into Western Europe. But this is kind of looked upon, Charlemagne and his period is looked upon, sometimes called, I see now that historians use Carolingian renewal. Some people go so far as to call it a Renaissance. Now we have the emergence of some new religious orders. So we have the period of Charlemagne, ends like in the 9th century. What follows is kind of another period of instability, politically, even within the church. There were challenges at that point. But now we have, as a reaction to that, the emergence of some new religious orders. While the Benedictines had dominated monastic life, really religious life, to this point, the 11th century saw the emergence of new orders that sought to reform and renew monastic life. So monastic life itself was in need of reform and renewal. Certainly a constant theme throughout the church's history is the need for constant renewal and reform. There's a very, if you're interested in following that up, there's a very good book by Christopher Bellito, who I think teaches at McCain University in New Jersey. And he has a book, a kind of a history of the church through the lens of reform and renewal. And he goes through the entire history of the church and shows how it's this successive progression. You know, the church, it's kind of this constant up and down, as it were. And I think we see it in our own time. We had Vatican II, then there's kind of a period after Vatican II, then there's, you know, the reform of John Paul II, you know, then things kind of, there's some things, I don't know whether it's appropriate to say they go down, but they're challenges. And then you know, we had the challenge, of course, with the resignation of Pope Benedict, and then Pope Francis comes in. So it is this movement throughout this thread throughout church history, you know. And there's a very ancient principle that the church itself is always in need of reform and redemption. Now, the most famous of these orders, the new orders, are the Cistercians, who lived the Benedictine rule more simply, austerely, and thus more perfectly. There was a strong emphasis on manual labor. To safeguard the life of contemplative union with God, the Cistercians did not engage in apostolic work or priestly ministry outside the monastery. So the Benedictines, they had as with any institution, it becomes comfortable. The Benedictine monasticism by this point had become so large, and as I mentioned earlier, these towns would grow up outside the monastery. It was not the monks themselves, of course, took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They individually were not wealthy, but the monasteries became wealthy. They became wealthy because they were landholders, they had farms, they employed people to work. So the Cistercians were a return back to the basics. The Cistercians themselves worked the farm. They didn't have other people there working them for them, but they themselves engaged in manual labor. I recently came across some articles and books by a contemporary figure, Eric Varden, who is a Trappist monk. He's Norwegian. He was raised as kind of a non-practicing Lutheran in his family. And he was sent to England for prep school, and he himself kind of had a religious reawakening, conversion experience, what do you want to call it. He went to Cambridge University, received a doctorate in theology. While at Cambridge, he decided to convert to Catholicism. But, and he stayed at Cambridge, he became a doctor. He was actually, I don't know what his position, but I think he was teaching at Cambridge. And then he discerned he had a vocation to religious life. And would you like to guess what order he went to? The Cistercians, but the most strict form of the Cistercians, the Trappists. And he entered the Trappists in England, probably around 2002, maybe 3. And, they, like many Trappist monasteries, they have their own working farm. And he says that his job, even though he was a Cambridge doctor, first couple of years, he took care of the cows and everything involved with the cows. And then I guess they probably thought, well, after he made his final vows and he was going to be, candidate for priesthood, well, what are we going to do with somebody who already has a doctorate in theology? So they sent him to Rome, and he lived with the Benedictines at their university in Rome, San Anselmo, and did a licensed degree in Oriental languages. Post-ordination, he taught there. And then he was called back to his monastery or abbey in England as abbot. So he was only ordained 4 or 5 years. And in 2020, Pope Francis named him as a bishop back in his native Norway, because there was such a scarcity or paucity of candidates who could be bishop. They wanted natives for bishop. They didn't, people who spoke the language of the people, who spoke Norwegian. And so that's where he is right now. And if you go on YouTube, there's some interesting interviews and things with him. He does appear, wearing Episcopal attire, but most of the time he's in his Cistercian habit. He wears his ring and pectoral cross. But he talks about what an adjustment this is, because going from living in the abbey, working on the farm, and the whole thrust of Cistercian life is they don't go out. I mean, it's a heavily cloistered life. They do receive visitors. They have guest houses. People can go there and make a retreat. I mean, I know people who go to Gethsemane and do retreats. And there's the place up in New York State, Genesee, the Abbey of Genesee. But he said, this has been such a huge adjustment. He said, I still try to live the Cistercian life. He said, fortunately, he said, Norway is more of a rural culture. But he said, it is an adjustment. It's just kind of interesting how a modern day Cistercian who's being called to service in the church. He discerns his vocation. The church, of course, discerns a different kind of service for him and how he has to adjust to that. So, good picture here. This is exactly what they do. They work their own farms. I'm sure you've seen in the food stores, Trappist preserves, Trappist breads. Okay, so now the High Middle Ages. So the 11th to the 13th centuries were a period of critical change. Western Europe developed from an agricultural or rural civilization to an urban one. So we're kind of going back in the other direction now. Church and state remained intertwined and at times were in tension. The most well-known clash was between the reforming Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV on the selection and liturgical installation of abbots and bishops, known as the investiture controversy. So the investiture controversy was the emperor, he wanted to be able to nominate bishops and abbots within his realms. And the Pope says, no. That's the job of the Pope. The Pope is the one who makes these selections. And the other thing that was going on is they say investiture, instead of the bishop or abbot, an abbot is usually, we say an abbot is blessed. A bishop is ordained. Back in these days, the bishop was consecrated. The emperor wanted to do that. And again, the Pope said, no. He said, this is done by the Pope or his delegate, who is another bishop or abbot. So that was what this was all about. Two very strong personalities clashing. It was resolved by the Concordat of Worms, which defined, it was kind of a job description. Emperor, this is your lane. You stay in your lane. Pope, this is your lane. You stay in your lane. So this, the picture is, you can see the king here on the left. He's handing the pastoral staff, presumably to the abbot. So that's what this was all about. This was also the period of the Crusades. So the late 11th century also witnessed the beginning of the Crusades, which lasted through the end of the 13th century and aimed to regain control of the Holy Land from the Muslims. A lasting effect of the Crusades on Catholic Christianity was that it awakened interest in the historical life of Jesus. This is probably one of the most important aspects of the Crusades, or consequences of the Crusades. This flowered into a strong and tender devotion to Christ's sacred humanity, especially the suffering of Christ in his passion and death. And this led to a shift in emphasis. So before this period, there was not so much of an emphasis on the humanity of Christ. The emphasis tended to be on the divinity of Christ. And there's a particular reason for that. What is one of the early Christian heresies that was very problematic? It was the Arians, who claimed that Jesus was true man, but he was not true God. So this is when we begin to find in the church's prayer and worship the emergence of the Trinitarian formulas. Jesus is co-equal of the same substance as the Father and the Holy Spirit. The emphasis then, to counteract the Arian heresy, the emphasis is on the divinity of Christ. And that is the lens through which the passion and death of Christ is viewed. So there's a shift and these terms, these are terms that are used in the writings of the times, from the Gloriosa Passio, the passion full of glory, centering on Jesus' burning love and victory over death, to the bitter passion, focusing on the suffering and sorrow of Jesus. There's a shift of emphasis from Christ the King of glory, the Rex Gloriae, to the man of sorrows. So there's some better, I've seen some other examples, but this is the only one I could find within the confines of time of preparing this. So this is before probably like 10th century Spanish crucifix. Now notice, I mean, they're not minimizing the suffering of Christ. I mean, he's crucified, you see the blood. But there's something there which is quite, we're not used to seeing.
Crown.
That gold crown, it's not the crown of thorns. It's a gold crown. The emphasis before the rise of this emphasis on the humanity of Christ was that Jesus, who suffered and died on the cross, this was his victory over sin and death. And some of the writers of the time, theologians, spiritual writers, they describe the cross as a trophy. And even later on, you see, there's that famous sculpture, for example, even in the Renaissance, of Michelangelo, where the risen Christ is shown holding the cross. He's holding the cross as that is his emblem of victory. And that is the way, so the way they looked upon the passion of Christ, it was Christ's victory over sin. But the idea of the trophy was in the Roman Empire, when the Romans would conquer a part of land or a people, they would plant this standard there. And they called that their trophy. And so the cross was really seen as Jesus' trophy, as he reclaimed humanity and was victorious over death. So as I said, it's different perspectives. If we think in our own day, the liturgy of Good Friday, certainly there are devotional practices that grow out of this emphasis on the passion of Christ, the stations of the cross. We walk through those 14 stages of the first Good Friday. The liturgy of Good Friday, however, for the church, the solemn liturgy of the Passion of Christ, is very much in line with this view of the glorious Passion. Even though the Passion is read, the Passion that's read is the Gospel of John, in which Jesus, again, is presented as the King and his victory over sin and death. And then, of course, in John's Gospel, there's always, on the cross, Jesus, when his side is pierced and flow out blood and water, he instituted the sacraments of baptism and Eucharist. He entrusts his mother to John the Baptist, to John the Apostle, and he founds the church. John makes it a point to say he breathes forth his Spirit. In John's Gospel, that is the Johannine Pentecost. He's breathing forth his Spirit into the world and upon the church. Very kind of dense theological. Okay, let's. So then we have another phenomenon, of course, is the rise of the universities from the monastic schools and the cathedral schools. Many cathedrals also had schools, and out of these two schools came the development of the great universities of Europe. Bologna, Paris, probably certainly the greatest. All the great teachers, theologians taught at Paris. And the universities now become the center of intellectual life, no longer the monasteries. New methods of teaching and study came to the fore. There was a need to systematize the vast amount of knowledge coming from the East, Greek, Arabic, and Jewish writings. So when the Crusaders went to the East, they bring back lots of texts. There's also a lot of refugees coming back when the Muslims reconquer the Holy Land. Then you have this influx into Europe of refugees from the Holy Land. And this led to a new form of theology, one that was more scientific in approach and method. The theology of the schools, the name that was given to it was scholasticism. Scholastic is a student. Scholastic is one who studies. As it came to be called, was greatly influenced by the logic and philosophy of Aristotle. It was more speculative and deductive in character, with a strong emphasis on reason and dialectic. It also brought about a lessening of the close connection that had previously existed between theology and devotion in monastic circles. So up to this time, theology was always with a view to the spiritual life. The emphasis was always, if you will, on the heart. The emphasis was on the affective, the emotions, the feelings, in a good sense of how they draw us to God. Now, what takes prominence or importance is the intellect, analysis, deductive reasoning, organization. So there's a shift in theology, which is, with all these things, it's not that one's right and one's wrong. They each have their pluses and minuses. And I just thought you would like that picture, the teacher up here, and of course, some students are paying attention to see this fella, he must have had a rough night the night before at the tavern. Here, these guys back here talking. The teacher needed his clicker. There's also emergence of new religious life, new religious orders. Remember, the monks, they stayed in the monastery. Cistercians, they were in their abbeys. They didn't go out. They didn't do ministry outside the abbey. The Benedictines, they were in their monasteries. They go out and do ministry now, but not at this time. They didn't. They took a vow of stability. And when you took the vow of stability, that means you stayed at the monastery. You weren't flitting about. You didn't go out. You didn't go back and visit your parents or your siblings. You entered, that was it. So the High Middle Ages also saw the emergence of a new, more flexible form of religious life, whose hallmarks were apostolic poverty and, all important, ministerial mobility. Thus, it was well suited to the growing urban nature of medieval society. Unlike the monks, who were pledged to stability, to remain in monasteries relatively removed from society, these new groups of friars traveled frequently for study, preaching, and other ministerial duties. So the friars, the best examples, or the most well-known examples, are the Dominicans and the Franciscans. There are and were others, the Augustinians, the Carmelites, but the two, most well-known examples are the Dominicans and Franciscans. Here we have this imagined meeting between Dominic here and Francis here, the two great founders of the orders. They would be out. They would go, they were itinerant preachers. They would be preaching missions in churches and parishes throughout Europe. They studied in the universities. Many of their members, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, were professors at the University of Paris or at Oxford. They were very much, they were religious. They lived a very strict form of religious life, but they were also engaged in these other arenas and areas of activity. The late Middle Ages. The calamitous 14th century. I couldn't resist the temptation to have Barbara Tuchman's book here because this just sums it up. Her famous best-selling book. If you haven't read it, it's a wonderful read. So the late medieval period, so we kind of started the Middle Ages as, you know, with the devastation and disruption, the end of the Roman Empire. Then we kind of have these peaks or high points. We have the Carolingian Renaissance. Then we have the High Middle Ages. We have the universities, the new orders. The end ends with a whimper. It's cyclical almost. The late medieval period was one of disruption and ferment, and the 14th century was particularly harsh, particularly difficult. A convergence of natural and political disasters struck Europe. The climate cooled, bringing about what has been called a little ice age. Summer temperatures dropped, harvests failed, and millions suffered from hunger and starvation. In addition, if that wasn't enough, an outbreak of bubonic plague, later referred to as the Black Death, brought by merchant ships returning from the east, ravaged the continent and Great Britain. And the century also witnessed the 100 Years' War between England and France over competing claims to the French crown and laying waste to parts of modern-day France and Belgium. So the 14th century was a pretty grim time. To make matters worse, on the church side, we have the Avignon papacy and the Western Schism. So the clergy were subject to the same stresses as the laity. Many died, starvation, the plague. Others fled in search of safety, abandoning their communities. The institutional church was also destabilized by political forces, resulting in the Avignon papacy. From 1309 to 1377, the Pope and the Curia resided in Avignon under French influence. So basically, French pressure was being brought to bear on the papacy and on the Pope. The French wanted an outsized influence and impact on the Pope. Pope Gregory XI returned the papacy permanently to Rome in early 1377, but died the following year. The subsequent papal election was later disputed. Another election was held in Avignon, resulting in both a pope in Rome and a second pope in Avignon. This came to be known as the Western or Papal Schism. The matter was resolved by the Council of Constance. The claimants from the Roman, Avignon, and Pisan lines either abdicated or were declared deposed, and in 1417 a new pope was elected, Martin V. I mean, this was just a huge scandal, and you can imagine what it would be to have two popes and all that. This actually is a painting by Giorgio Vasari, an Italian Renaissance painter known for his brilliant colors, and it's the return of Pope Gregory from Avignon to Rome. So in the background, this is really the Avignon Papal Palace. And notice Gregory's being carried, in the Sede Gestatorio, as so-called, the chair. But notice who's up in the sky. Peter and Paul. So we have Peter with his keys, Paul with his sword, and notice they're pointing the way. You need to go back to Rome. The 14th and 15th centuries, the late Middle Ages, were also transitioned to the Renaissance and Reformation. This was the period of Dante, Petrarch, Giotto, the great artist and architect, and also some of these heterodox priest theologians, John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, who were kind of the precursors of the Protestant Reformation. So things are starting to percolate, you know. In the 15th century, the influence of the rediscovery of classical and Christian antiquity was being more widely felt. With the fall of Constantinople to the Muslim Ottoman Turks in 1453, the date many consider the end of the Middle Ages, new copies of classical and early Christian texts poured into Western Europe along with Christian refugees. This new material boosted the fresh intellectual and artistic urge to return to the sources that would shape secular and religious life into the 16th century. Often, periods of reform and renewal are sparked by this constant return to the sources, to the original sources. That happened before Vatican II as well. I don't think, before Vatican II, starting probably in the 20s, 30s, 40s, into the 50s, there was a whole renaissance or renewal that took place in biblical studies, in the studies of the early Christian authors, of spirituality, especially medieval and early modern spirituality, and all of that prepared the way for Vatican II. Many of the people who were heading that were disciplined by Rome at one point, like in the 40s and 50s. Vatican II comes, and now they're the leaders of the church. So the way things kind of come around. And I'm thinking of people like Henri de Lubac, also some of the Dominicans, Chenu, and others. These people, you know, they were kind of operating under a shadow. They were told, you know, the Vatican would tell them, their superior generals, if they were religious, these men cannot teach. They can't speak out, they can't speak publicly because of their publications, which were basically a return to, they're saying, you know, we need to look deeper. We need to go back to the early Christian sources, to the fathers of the church. We need to go back to the original, you know, Greek and Aramaic texts. Well, that was kind of out of favor in a certain period. But they're the ones who end up really being the ones who are the engine for Vatican II. There was also at this time a flowering of the mystical tradition, and the late medieval mystics, the Rhineland mystics, St. Catherine of Siena, of course, a very popular saint. I think Brother Dan talked about her last semester. And the English mystics, and of course the most well-known, Julian of Norwich. I think she's has enjoyed some renewed popularity. Probably the most highly influential reform movement in spirituality was called the Devotio Moderna, the New Devotion, which came out of the Netherlands, and its hallmarks, it's kind of a reaction against scholasticism and against the over-intellectualization of religion and faith. And so it emphasizes an affect of piety and a strong devotion to Christ. While firmly rooted in the earlier monastic tradition, it also had a largely popular orientation. So it was not only geared to monks and nuns in convents and monasteries, it was really gauged to the laity. It was really kind of almost an anticipation of the universal call to holiness. And the most well-known example of this trend is this book, The Imitation of Christ. Very popular book. My father was a convert to Catholicism, and he became a very devout Catholic. He basically converted from nothing to Catholicism, was very devout. And I remember that he had a copy of The Imitation of Christ. Now, of course, growing up, I had no idea of any of this. But I do remember he had The Imitation of Christ, and that was what he read, which was very typical of kind of a pre-Vatican II spirituality, I think, for lay people. He would, before he and my mother were married, he underwent instruction one-on-one. There was no such thing as, Christian initiation and the catechumenate and so forth. So it was kind of one-on-one instruction, and I'm sure that's where he picked it up, from the priest who instructed him. And then I think one thing to really take away from this, the Middle Ages is hugely important because it really forms the foundation for everything that follows. It forms a foundation in a positive, it can form a foundation in a positive way, in that some of the trends that are there are deepened as the church moves on and people delve into them more deeply, even if they continue to develop them and to advance them. But then there's also a reaction against the Middle Ages. And that reaction was pretty much the Protestant Reformation. So after the Devotio Moderna, there were no new or vibrant movements. The long period of the Middle Ages was drawing to an end, and there was little energy or resources left to deal with the new challenges that lay ahead. The 16th century, the beginning of the modern era, would bring profound changes to the church and society. And those changes would be, the Middle Ages would be the foundation, not only, as I say, for the Protestant Reformation, and there will be points of continuity and points of discontinuity. The reformers were formed basically in the late Middle Ages. There are things that they will take, and then there are other things they'll react against. And the same on the Catholic side. The Middle Ages would also lay the foundation for the renewal of what we call the Catholic Reform after the Council of Trent. You know, for people like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Ignatius Loyola, Francis de Sales, and some of the French thinkers as well, but across the board. So the Middle Ages, as I said, it's been kind of a breathtaking tour, quick tour, but it's hugely important, and it really serves, even though the humanists thought there was the period in between, it ends up being a really foundational and important period. Thank you very much. As always, great. I'll take questions. I know people